Chapter 11. Germany's youngest top-rated glider pilot. Early in 1943, the raids on our industrial cities began in a deadly 1-2 punch. The British Royal Air Force bombed us at night, and the Americans in the daytime. Oberhausen, where my parents and twin brother lived, were one of the target cities. My mother wrote that she and my brother spent night after night, either in the fortified basement, where their store had been, or in the huge public air raid bunker down the street. My father was stubborn. He refused to leave his bedroom, even after most of the ceiling plaster had come down on him. After a particularly heavy raid on June 11th, my brother and his entire school were evacuated to the Tatra Mountains of Czechoslovakia. This was part of the government's plan to remove children in target areas to safer places. Soon, many other cities were following this plan, usually with the blessing of the parents. They had no choice anyway, since the Nazi Party and the Hitler Youth gave all the orders. Under the KLV program, Kinderlandvertschicgung, child evacuation to the country, more than 500,000 German children were shipped to safety in remote parts of the Reich. Often, whole schools with their teachers were evacuated. Czechoslovakia, where Alphonse's brother went, was a common refuge. High in the mountains, away from the threat of bombs, the children resumed their studies. Hitler Youth leaders in charge of the KLV took full advantage of the children being away from the parents and priests to fill their heads full of Nazi ideas. They also took advantage of the empty schools in the cities, using them as hospitals and shelters for people who lost their homes in the bombings. Alphonse, since he did not live in a target area, was never part of the KLV. I lived in a fool's paradise that year, partly because I had not yet experienced any danger, and partly because I was always busy. During the summer, Rabbit and I were assigned together at Camp Wengerhor, training to take the test for the C rating, the top rating for glider pilots. Our commandant, Sturmbannführer Winkler, personally supervised all future C pilots. He was such a superb pilot himself that he once landed a glider on a soup plate in the middle of a yellow landing cross. While we admired his tremendous flying skill, we feared his discipline and his cutting sarcasm. He was a fanatic Nazi. Unfortunately for Rabbit and me, it was Winkler who discovered us one afternoon sitting behind the hangar in the sun. Since we were never allowed to sit down on the flight line, we knew we were in trouble. The commandant chased us across the field on his motorbike until we dropped in our tracks, then threatened to finish the job that night. He was as good as his word. Half an hour before lights out, we reported to his office. He pointed wordlessly to his motorbike outside. Away we went. Whenever we slowed down, Winkler drove the wheel into our heels until we finally stumbled and collapsed. At last, he left us to lie on the other end of the huge field, coughing our lungs out in the wet grass. Winkler, like many other commandants in charge of new recruits, was a veteran of heavy fighting. He had been shot down in the Battle of Britain and suffered a paralyzed arm, which made him unfit for combat flying. By mid-1943, the German military had lost millions of soldiers to death or injury. The Allied bombing raids, the siege of Russia, the battles in the African desert had all taken huge tolls on Germany's manpower. For us future pilots of the Luftwaffe, one glance into the sky told us how badly we were needed. We saw all too clearly how thin the Luftwaffe was now spread. We understood, too, why Sturmbannführer Winkler pushed us so hard for the good of Germany. To fill the ranks of the dead and wounded, the military began calling up older men and more teens. Boys of 16 could now be drafted, as could men up to age 65. Many of the men had been working in aircraft and ammunition factories. To take their places, the government began calling in women ages 17 to 50 to work in the plants. At first, many women were horrified at the thought of working in a factory. They had grown up believing that a German woman's life should be focused on the 3 Ks: Kirche, Kinder, Küche. Church, children, kitchen. Most had never worked outside their homes, and knew nothing about operating factory equipment. While shifts were sometimes shorter for married ladies, most women worked 56 hours a week. Because many of them had small children, the government operated nurseries. By 1944, these centers were caring for more than 1 million children whose mothers worked in the factories. Older children also became vital to the military. Hitler Youth leader Arthur Axmann promised to provide 6 million 10 to 15-year-olds to help the war effort. Younger children were sent to farms to help harvest crops, collect clothing, and gather scrap metal or cloth. Teenagers became Flakhelfer, flak helpers, whose job it was to man huge anti-aircraft guns. With the aid of powerful searchlights, the Flakhelfer would scan the skies for incoming Allied bombers and fire at them with the powerful guns set up on the ground. Unfortunately, the Flakhelfer made easy targets for enemy aircraft. As they cradled dying comrades in their arms, these young teens turned rapidly into men. Suddenly, they saw that war was savage. Death was final. This was not the grand, patriotic adventure they'd been led to believe. Delusions of power and glory exploded all around them. Screams of horror and fear could be heard above the blasts of the bombs. These kids had to grow up fast, for the fatherland needed men, now. To impress upon the boys the important role they played in the Reich, officers talked frankly and directly to them. The future pilots at Camp Wengerrohr were visited by Major General Adolf Galland, Germany's highest-ranking fighter pilot. "Boys," he said quietly to the group as they prepared to eat lunch, "I don't have to tell you that this isn't 1939. I hope you do your very best to finish your training, because our old bones are getting tired. We need you badly." That was all Alphonse and his brothers had to hear. The fatherland needed them. They would be ready. Rabbit and I were the youngest pilots on the advanced team. We were also among the 4 best. By the last week of the course, it appeared certain we would gain the C rating. All we had left were the final 5 test flights. My first 3 tries went like clockwork. On the 4th flight, as I banked toward the village church steeple, the wind suddenly shifted to the east in a violent gust, blowing me off course. I was coming in much too fast, as well as too high to land anywhere near the yellow marker. Suddenly, I saw our instructor waving a blue flag over his head. It was the signal to circle. "Must be a mistake," I said to myself. "I can't risk a sharp banking circle this close to the ground." I ignored the order, landing some 400 yards past the cross. No doubt about it, I had blown this one. Back at the flight line, I was told to report to Commandant Winkler. "Are you aware," he demanded in his high-pitched voice, "that you disobeyed my direct order to circle?" "I didn't know it was you, Herr Sturmbannführer," I stammered. "I was merely using my judgment as a pilot." "So," he said sarcastically, "here we have a superior pilot who takes it upon himself to override an order." Then, pausing a moment, he screamed, "On the front, I would have you shot, you miserable Schweinhund! You are suspended from further flight duty as of now." Disobeying an order, particularly in battle, was punishable by death. Age made no difference. If you were fighting on the front, you were a man, and you'd be treated like one. By disobeying an order, you could endanger the lives of your fellow soldiers, an inexcusable crime. No individual decision-making was allowed. All thinking was left to your superiors. For 3 days, Alphonse languished in the Camp Wengerrohr kitchen, doing the dirtiest work the mess head could find. He was under very strict watch. Sitting down without asking permission was a major offense. His life in the Luftwaffe was over before it began, he told himself, and he cursed the moment he had chosen to ignore Winkler's flag. On the 4th morning, the commandant himself suddenly appeared in the kitchen. Walking directly up to Alphonse, he began questioning him as though they were still out on the flight line. "Do you maintain that it was your right, as a pilot, to override a signal?" Before I had a chance to answer, he lifted his hand. "Let me rephrase that. Would you do it again in order to save the plane?" "No, Herr Sturmbannführer, not even to save me. I replied earnestly. After a long pause, he announced, I'm going to give you just 2 tries for your 2 remaining test flights. Alphonse's heart hammered. A second chance. He knew how lucky he was to get one. It didn't happen often. When you disobeyed an order, there usually was no appeal. His mind raced as he jumped into his coveralls and headed for the flight line. Despite gusty winds, the first test went well. As he was being towed back for the second, Alphonse reminded himself of what the last flight meant. If he did well, he would be awarded the C, the highest rating for glider pilots. At age 15, that would make him the youngest pilot in Germany to receive this prestigious award. There are occasional moments in any flyer's life when things seem to go well almost by themselves. This was one of them. I sailed around the church steeple as if in a dream on a firm stream of wind. A woman hanging out her wash waved at me. I pulled the wing brakes and set the machine down smack in the center of the yellow cross. Bullseye. Sliding the canopy back to let the wind fan my sweating face, I glanced quickly around to see if the tow crew was near yet, and then I kissed the rim of the cockpit. Life had never seemed more beautiful. That evening, the commandant awarded the emblem with the 3 wings to each of us 8 pilots who had earned the C. That took place in the mess hall after dinner. As Winkler handed us the blue medal, he stepped back and raised his arm. Heil Hitler, Kameraden. The Führer is proud of you. Heil Hitler, we shouted back in unison. The next day was the last at Camp Wengerhor for Alphonse, Rabbit, and the rest of the new C-rated glider pilots. From here, they would return to their home bases for reassignment as officer cadets in the Luftwaffe. Out on the flight line, the clear, cool morning was broken by the sound of an alarm, alerting the camp to a huge formation of American B-17 bombers in the north. Presuming that the Americans' target was a larger city farther on, Commandant Winkler ordered the boys to stay on the field. Their attention was focused on the Kranich, a high-performance sailplane that none of them had yet flown. Carefully, Alphonse strapped Rabbit into the cockpit, ready to test the new craft. Rabbit was on a free flight, which meant he could fly any pattern he liked. Sergeant Baum, piloting the tow plane, pulled him to a height of 300 meters. Here, the two turned away from each other. Baum stayed in the air, circling the target. At that moment, the sound of powerful engines began to swell from the west. One of the officers swung around with his binoculars and let out a yell. "Into the ditch! Enemy aircraft!" Out of the cleft of the forest roared 2 fighter planes with the 5-cornered American star on their wings. The officer on the ground frantically fired 2 red shooting stars in the direction of Rabbit's plane. I don't think that would have saved his life, but Sergeant Baum's quick action did. Without any hesitation, Baum climbed toward the enemy planes. As soon as they spied the little aircraft, they screamed around in a tight circle and dove to attack. There was a couple of deep, hammering cannon bursts, and Baum's unarmed plane exploded about 100 feet above the field. Nothing remained that could be recognized as an aircraft or its pilot. Baum's death weighed very heavily on Rabbit, especially when Winkler praised the sergeant in his farewell speech to us. "Never forget, Jordan," he said to Rabbit, "that Sergeant Baum died so that you might live. You, in turn, owe your life to the fatherland." We knew that Baum's life was the most noble of all actions, to give one's life for a comrade. As we turned to leave, I saw tears in Rabbit's eyes.